What happens if the Golden Throne fails? Not in some distant myth, not in a vague prophecy, but suddenly, irreversibly, in a single terrible moment when the ancient machine beneath the Emperor finally breaks, and the one system holding together the heart of humanity simply stops. Would the Emperor die? Would he rise? Would Terra be consumed? Would the Astronomican vanish and leave a million worlds blind in the dark? Or would something even worse happen first? Tonight, we're going deep into one of the biggest and most frightening questions in all of Warhammer 40,000. Not just what the Golden Throne is, but what it actually does, why the Imperium depends on it, and what the failure of that vast, half-understood relic would mean for Earth, for the Warp, and for human civilization itself. And the truly unsettling part is this. The Imperium already believes that day is coming. The throne is failing now. It has been failing for a very long time, and nobody alive really knows how to fix it. The Golden Throne is one of those things in Warhammer 40K that almost everyone recognizes, but very few people fully unpack. It is not merely a chair or a life support device, or a throne in the ceremonial sense. It is a machine of impossible age and impossible complexity. It is a psychic engine, a prison, a seal, a beacon, and a support system all at once. It is the center of the Imperium in both practical and spiritual terms. It keeps the Emperor anchored to material existence. It empowers the Astronomican by making his psychic guidance possible. And it helps hold shut a nightmare beneath the Imperial Palace that, if ever opened fully, could doom Terra in an instant. To understand what happens if the Golden Throne fails, we first need to understand why the Emperor ended up on it at all. During the final days of the Horus Heresy, the Master of Mankind confronted Horus aboard the War Master's flagship. And though Horus was destroyed, the Emperor suffered catastrophic wounds. He was returned to Terra on the edge of death. But his placement upon the Golden Throne was not just a medical decision. Even before the duel with Horus, the throne had already been central to his plans. It was tied to immense secret works beneath the Imperial Palace, including the Hidden Webway project, the Emperor's attempt to create a human-controlled passage network that would free mankind from dependence on the warp for interstellar travel. That project had gone catastrophically wrong. Because of Magnus the Red's warning, delivered through disastrous sorcery, the wards and barriers protecting the Human Webway project were breached. The result was horror on a scale few in the Imperium ever learned. The passager beneath Terra became battlefields in a secret war. Demonic forces pushed at the breach, legions fought and died in darkness. And the Emperor himself was forced to sit upon the throne for long periods, using his unimaginable psychic might to hold closed the disaster and prevent direct invasion into the heart of Terra. So from the start, the Golden Throne was more than a support system. It was a plug in the wall of reality. After the heresy, with the Emperor mortally wounded, the throne became his prison and his conduit. Since then, for 10,000 years, the Imperium has continued because that machine still functions, however poorly, and because the Emperor, or what remains of him in a material sense, still endures upon it. That brings us to the first great consequence of failure, the fate of the Emperor himself. The exact condition of the Emperor in the current age is one of the central ambiguities of the setting. He is not alive in any normal sense. He is also not dead in any normal sense. His body is described as withered, ruined, barely sustained by the machinery of the throne. Yet his soul, psychic presence, or divine aspect remains overwhelmingly real. He communicates rarely and opaquely, but there is enough evidence across the lore to show that he still acts, still exerts power, and still influences events. The Astronomican burns because of him. Demons hate him. Saints are empowered in his name. Guilliman's audience with the Emperor showed something vast and shattered, but undeniably active. So if the Golden Throne fails, one possibility is simple and horrifying. The Emperor's physical body finally dies. On the surface, many might assume that this changes little. After all, the Emperor is already functionally a corpse on a machine. But in 40K, body and soul matter in very strange ways. The material anchor of a being that powerful may be all that keeps his presence focused in a useful direction. If the throne stops sustaining his mortal remains, his spirit may not remain bound to Terra in the same way. It might dissipate, transform, ascend, explode outward, or be forced into some new state that nobody can predict. And this is where one of the most persistent theories enters the discussion. If the Emperor dies completely, could he be reborn? The idea is not baseless. In older lore and fan interpretation, the Emperor's nature has often been tied to perpetuality, reincarnation, and psychic persistence. Other perpetuals in the setting can return from death, though not always instantly, and not always under the same circumstances. The Emperor is unique, far beyond them in scale, but uniqueness cuts both ways. Perhaps death would free him to regenerate. Perhaps death would at last allow him to become fully active again. But the problem is obvious. No one can safely test this theory. If the Emperor can be reborn, how long would it take? Seconds? Years? Centuries? And what would happen during that gap? Terra cannot survive that experiment. Even if the Emperor were to return eventually, the immediate consequences of the throne failing would likely be apocalyptic long before any resurrection could matter. This is why the Imperium clings to the current state, however terrible and decaying. Better a dying god on a broken machine than a leap into total uncertainty. There is another darker possibility. The Emperor's death might not lead to rebirth at all. It might instead mean annihilation of his body and fragmentation of his soul, or a violent psychic event beyond comprehension. A being of his magnitude, dying at the center of humanity's spiritual empire, could trigger effects across both real space and the warp. The Emperor is not just one powerful psyker among many. He is arguably the single greatest human psychic presence ever to exist. If that force was suddenly unbound, the consequences might resemble a stellar explosion in the psychic dimension. And Terra would be standing at ground zero. That leads directly to the second great consequence of failure, the loss of the Astronomican. For the Imperium, the Astronomican is civilization. Without it, the galaxy does not merely become harder to cross, it becomes incoherent. Warp travel in Warhammer 40K is not like travel through empty space with a simple map and engine. Ships enter the Imperium, a dimension of madness, emotion, predation, and impossible geometry. Navigators guide their vessels by perceiving the Astronomican, the great psychic beacon projected from Terra. It is the lighthouse of the Imperium. It does not make warp travel safe, but it makes it possible on a meaningful scale. It provides reference. It gives direction. It lets ships attempt long-distance jumps across interstellar space with some hope of arriving where and when they intended. If the Golden Throne fails, the Astronomican likely goes dark, or at minimum becomes unstable and unreliable. That one event alone could break the Imperium more thoroughly than many wars. The Imperium is often described as impossibly vast, and that scale matters here. It is not a tightly integrated state with instant communication and smooth logistics. It is already a lumbering nightmare of delay, confusion, and regional isolation. Worlds can go years, decades, or centuries between meaningful contacts. Orders arrive too late. Reinforcements miss campaigns. Administratum records contradict one another. And yet, despite all of that dysfunction, there is still a connective tissue. Fleets move, tides are collected, crusades are launched, astropaths communicate, navis nobilite steer the void ships. The beacon on Terra, powered through the Emperor's continued existence and the machinery around him, remains the great fixed point around which human galactic life organizes itself. Remove that, And the result would not simply be slower travel, it would be fragmentation on a civilizational scale. Entire sectors would become isolated, supply lines would collapse, forge worlds would lose contact with agri-worlds that feed them, shrine worlds would be cut off from pilgrims and fleets, Astra Militarum regiments in transit might vanish or emerge in the wrong regions. Segmentum command structures would disintegrate into local emergency rule. Rogue traders might become the only link between pockets of surviving humanity. Some worlds would turn inward and survive as independent fortress states. Others would starve, revolt, or be overrun because help never comes. The Imperium already struggles to coordinate against orcs, Tyranids, Chaos warbands, Necron dynasties, Drukhari raids, and internal rebellion. With the Astronomican gone, many of those threats would suddenly become local extinction events. A world under siege might know relief is theoretically out there, somewhere among the stars, but theory means nothing if no fleet can navigate the storm to reach them. There is also the question of communication. Astropathic messages do not depend on the Astronomican in the same direct way navigation does, but the broader psychic environment and imperial infrastructure absolutely matter. If Terra falls into psychic chaos and the Emperor's guiding presence disappears, the reliability of communication could decline sharply. Misinterpretation, delay, and silence would increase. The chain of command would splinter. Claimants to authority would multiply. Regional lords, cardinals, admirals, and generals would begin making independent choices without clear sanction from the center. And in the Imperium, when central authority weakens, someone always reaches for the crown. That would mean civil wars, not one, but thousands. Some systems would continue to worship the Emperor and preserve old forms loyally, even without confirmation from Terra. Others would decide the High Lords had failed and establish autonomous empires. Some might elevate living saints, chapter masters, planetary governors, or Mechanicus archmagi into practical sovereigns. Some would descend into religious panic and mass hysteria. Others would become prey for cults, promising certainty amid the dark. The Imperium would not vanish overnight in a neat, single collapse. It would shatter unevenly. And that is before we get to Terra itself, because the third and most immediate consequence of the Golden Throne failing is likely the disaster beneath the Imperial Palace. This is the part that makes the question so catastrophic. If the throne were only life support and beacon machinery, its loss would be civilization ending enough. But it is also connected to the ancient breach in the human webway project. The Emperor has, for millennia, been part of the mechanism preventing a full demonic eruption through that wound. There are barriers, wards, systems, and secret defenses layered beyond normal understanding. But the broad truth is brutally simple. Something terrible is trying to get in. The Golden Throne helps keep it out. If that function ceases, Terra may face an immediate warp incursion on a scale that dwarfs almost any invasion in Imperial history. Imagine the throne failing, not as a quiet fade, but as a seal breaking under pressure accumulated for 10,000 years. The hidden passages beneath the palace could become open arteries into nightmare. Daemons would pour through. Reality itself could weaken. Custodians, Sisters of Silence, Mechanicus adepts, and every defense force on Terra would be thrown into a battle that may already be lost the moment it begins. And Terra is not just a world, it is the throne world. It is the most populated, fortified, symbolic, and politically central planet in the Imperium. Billions upon billions live there, depending on the era and source. It houses irreplaceable institutions, archives, command structures, relics, fleets, and priesthoods. Its fall would be materially catastrophic, but the psychological and spiritual impact might be even greater. The holy world of mankind, the cradle of the species, the seat of the God Emperor, suddenly overrun by warp horror. That would not just kill people, it would rupture faith across the stars. There is reason to think the immediate result could be even worse than an invasion. Some interpretations suggest that if the breach beneath the palace fully opens, Terra could effectively become another massive warp rift, not merely attacked by daemons, but transformed into a gateway or consumed in a dimensional catastrophe. We have seen what stable or semi-stable warp storms and rifts do to star systems. The Great Rift split the galaxy in half. The Eye of Terra swallowed whole regions. If the Emperor's final barrier on Terra breaks, the birthplace of humanity could become the center of a new infernal wound in reality. That possibility is one reason the Imperium can never simply unplug the throne, even if some secretly believe the Emperor might return stronger afterward. Too much is chained to that seat. Too many apocalypses sit waiting behind a single failure point. And then there is a fourth consequence, one that complicates everything. The Emperor might not simply die. He might change. In recent Warhammer lore, the Emperor often feels less like a static corpse god and more like a vast being in transition. Worship on a galactic scale has grown around him for 10,000 years. Trillions pray to him. Countless souls believe in his divinity absolutely. Miracles occur in his name. The warp is shaped by thought, emotion, belief, and souls. So it is reasonable, within the logic of the setting, to ask whether the Emperor has been transformed by worship into something akin to a god in truth, not just in title. If so, then the failure of the Golden Throne could be the catalyst for a new state of existence. That might sound hopeful at first. Perhaps the corpse would perish and the god would rise. Perhaps the being that emerges could smite chaos, relight the stars, and remake the Imperium. But Warhammer is rarely that kind. Any transition of that scale would likely be violent, ambiguous, and costly beyond imagination. If the Emperor ascends into a fully warp-active god while his body dies, the burst of psychic force could devastate Terra. His new nature might be less comprehensible, less human, and less concerned with individual lives than even before. He might become a being of order, wrath, sacrifice, and domination so absolute that what survives of humanity finds itself serving something holier, but also more terrible. And there is a theological problem. The Emperor spent much of his life opposing superstition and religion, only to become the center of the greatest religion in human history. If he ascends through belief, that would be a cosmic irony of almost unbearable scale. The rational architect of secular empire would become the god created by the faith he despised. Whether that god would still meaningfully be the same emperor is another question entirely. Meanwhile, chaos would not sit idle. The failure of the Golden Throne would be one of the greatest opportunities the ruinous powers ever received. Terra has always been the ultimate prize. To corrupt or consume the center of humanity, destroy the Emperor's physical anchor, extinguish the Astronomican, and throw the Imperium into chaos. Anarchic fracture would be a victory beyond Horus's greatest dreams. Khorne would rejoice in the wars that follow, Tzeentch in the shattered plans and rearranged futures, Nurgle in the despair of a dying civilization, Slaanesh in the ecstasies and agonies of a species losing its spiritual center. Daemonic incursions would surge, cults would bloom on isolated worlds, traitor legions would launch immediate offensives wherever astropathic silence and navigational collapse created weakness. Abaddon, if positioned to exploit it, would likely press every advantage with apocalyptic force. The Long War would enter a new and bloodier age. And yet, even here, the outcome would not be simple. Chaos thrives on corruption and conflict, but if the Emperor truly did ascend into a stronger, warp-active state, that might threaten the gods in a new way. A reborn or transformed Emperor could become a direct metaphysical enemy of enormous power. So, from the perspective of chaos, the throne failing could be either the final victory or the beginning of a different kind of war. That uncertainty makes the topic so compelling. No faction can fully know what lies on the other side of the event. The Adeptus Custodes certainly understand the stakes better than most. For 10,000 years, they have guarded the master of mankind and the sanctum around him with absolute devotion. Unlike many imperial institutions, the custodes are not merely ceremonial defenders wrapped in tradition. They are among the few who retain some measure of clarity about the old purpose of the throne, the dangers beneath the palace, and the emperor's continuing significance beyond public myth. If the throne began to fail catastrophically, the custodes would almost certainly be the first line of response, locking down the palace, mobilizing hidden defenses, and attempting impossible containment. But even they may not be enough. The Mechanicus adds another layer to the crisis. Officially and practically, many of the systems that sustain the Golden Throne are maintained by the Adeptus Mechanicus, especially the most sacred and specialized priesthoods on Terra and Mars. But maintenance is not understanding. That is one of the great themes of the setting. The Imperium preserves technologies it no longer truly comprehends. It recites rites where once there were manuals. It swaps components according to inherited dogma, because the original principles are lost. The Golden Throne may be the ultimate example of this problem. Over the millennia, endless work has gone into preserving it. Parts have been replaced, systems have been patched, rituals have multiplied around engineering tasks. Entire traditions exist to keep one impossible machine from finally giving up. Yet the law strongly implies that the people tending it do not possess complete mastery over what it is. They know enough to continue the vigil, but not enough to restore it to original function or recreate it if it fails beyond a certain point. That means the Imperium's most important machine is irreplaceable and only partially understood. There are very few strategic situations worse than that. This also explains why the failure of the throne is so terrifyingly plausible. We are not discussing a theoretical machine in perfect condition. We are discussing a relic under endless strain, operating for 10,000 years after a galactic civil war and a psychic catastrophe, maintained by an empire famous for technological decay. The fact that it still functions at all is almost miraculous. The fear that one day it will not is entirely reasonable. Some stories in the broader lore suggest the Mechanicus and other imperial authorities have sought solutions, replacements, or supplementary systems. There are hints of desperate projects, forbidden research, and dangerous hope. But these efforts carry their own risks. To tamper with the throne carelessly might trigger the very disaster one hopes to prevent. Boldly risks charges of tech heresy, spiritual outrage, and practical catastrophe. So the Imperium remains trapped in its usual dilemma. It depends on what it cannot fully repair, and it fears the methods that might save it. This paralysis is profoundly 40K. Now let's widen the view beyond Terra and the machinery itself, and ask what ordinary human life across the galaxy would look like if the throne failed. For many worlds, the first sign might be silence. No new ships, no fresh directives, no tithing fleets, no pilgrim convoys. Astropathic messages become garbled, contradictory, or absent. Local authorities insist everything is under control, while privately panicking. Then trade begins to fail. Ammunition stocks thin, replacement parts run out, food imports stop. Ecclesiarchy preachers declare tests of faith. Riots break out in hive underlevels. Noble houses accuse one another of hoarding or treachery. Mutant cults and chaos sects begin offering explanations that are, for frightened people, alarmingly persuasive. On frontier worlds, the experience might be different, but no less grim. Garrisons realize reinforcement is not coming. The stars that once carried imperial authority now carry only uncertainty. Governors must choose whether to husband fuel for defense, evacuation, or one desperate attempt to reach nearby systems. Some worlds would rediscover local identity after millennia as mere imperial units. Some would become heroic little bastions. Others would fall to barbarism in a generation. For Space Marine chapters, the consequences would vary. Chapters with stable home territories and strong fleets might become regional defenders, acting as de facto sovereign powers, while remaining nominally loyal to the Emperor. Others, especially fleet-based chapters or those dependent on wider imperial logistics, could struggle to coordinate and resupply. Some might embark on holy wars to reach Terra. Some might divide over interpretation of the disaster. A few, under enough strain and isolation, might edge towards schism or damnation. History shows that even the angels of death are not immune to desperation. The Imperial Guard, or Astra Militarum, would suffer horribly. Its strength is mass mobilization across innumerable worlds, but mass without coordination is waste. Regiments stranded light years from support would become refugees, mercenaries, local tyrants, or dead. Navy battle groups unable to navigate reliably could be trapped in isolated clusters. Crusades would disintegrate. Some commanders would preserve order through discipline and sacrifice. Others would seize power in the name of emergency necessity. The ecclesiarchy, interestingly, might both suffer and surge. On one hand, the visible failure of Terra and the silence of the Astronomican could shatter confidence. On the other, religious fervor thrives in catastrophe. Prophets, saints, false saints, penitential armies, and redemption cults would erupt across the Imperium. Some would keep worlds united. Some would burn them down. The line between salvation and fanatic ruin is very thin in 40K, and usually crossed at speed. As for the Inquisition, every ordo would face a nightmare too broad to control. Heresy, mutation, demonology, Xenos opportunism, rebellion, and doctrinal collapse would spike everywhere at once. Inquisitors might become the last effective agents of continuity in some regions. In others, they would worsen the chaos, purging potential allies or fighting among themselves over what the failure means. Did the Emperor die, ascend, withdraw? Is Terra lost? Should one preserve local humanity at any cost, or enforce orthodoxy, even as civilization burns? There would be no shortage of zeal, but certainty would be in short supply. And then there is Mars. Mars is not just a neighboring planet to Terra in symbolic terms. It is the forge heart of the Sol system, and one of the greatest industrial, religious, and technological centers in the Imperium. Golden Throne fails. Mars would instantly become one of the most important and dangerous places in existence. The Mechanicus would face impossible choices. Do they throw everything into saving the throne? Do they prepare evacuation and continuity plans? Do they activate hidden contingencies? Do factions within the priesthood of Mars blame one another, split apart, or seek to control whatever remains of the Emperor's machinery for their own dogmatic ends? A fractured Mechanicus during a throne failure would be almost as disastrous as the failure itself. The forge worlds of the Imperium depend on patterns, authority, doctrine, and exchange. If Mars becomes a battleground of ideology, many of the Empire's remaining productive arteries could clot at once. There is also a more speculative but important issue. The Golden Throne may incorporate technology far beyond standard Imperial science, possibly drawing from archaeotech, unique human genius, and perhaps even knowledge gained from interactions with the webway and other ancient mysteries. If it fails catastrophically, those systems could be destroyed forever. The Imperium would not just lose a machine, it would lose the possibility of learning from it. Whatever hidden principles still survive inside that monumental relic might vanish in fire, warp breach, or ritualized scuttling. And that would be fittingly tragic. In Warhammer 40K, humanity is constantly surrounded by remnants of lost greatness it can neither fully reclaim nor safely abandon. The throne is the grandest relic of that pattern. Its failure would be the final proof that the Imperium has been living on borrowed time, sustained by inheritance rather than renewal. At this point, we should confront a question many people ask. Hasn't the throne been failing for ages already? And if so, why hasn't everything ended yet? The answer is that Warhammer 40K thrives on prolonged catastrophe. The Imperium exists in a state of almost ending. The Golden Throne is failing, but slowly, unevenly, through emergency maintenance, sacrifice, and divine or quasi-divine endurance. Thousands of psychers are fed into imperial systems as part of the vast machinery surrounding the Emperor and the Astronomican. Rare knowledge is hoarded, components are replaced when possible. Rituals are observed with desperate precision. Catastrophe is delayed, not solved. This delay matters because it shapes imperial culture. The Imperium is a civilization built around triage. It does not believe in golden futures anymore. It believes in holding the wall one more night. The throne is the perfect symbol of that mindset. Every prayer, every tithe, every black ship gathering psychers, every fleet navigating by the Emperor's light is part of a civilization-wide effort to sustain one dying center for one more day. So what happens if that day finally ends? The most likely answer is not a single outcome, but a cascade. First, the throne fails beyond recovery, whether through gradual collapse, sabotage, invasion, overload, or some mysterious internal end. The Emperor's body either dies outright or ceases to function as a viable anchor. Simultaneously, the systems maintaining the psychic seal beneath the palace destabilize. A demonic breach erupts in the underpalace and spreads upward. Custodies and all available defenders respond, but they are fighting against a metaphysical flood. At nearly the same moment, the Astronomican gutters and dies, or becomes too unstable to guide long-range navigation. Across the Imperium, navigators panic. Ships in the warp are lost. Fleets abort jumps or vanish. Astropathic choirs scream of fire, silence, and blindness. On Terra, mass panic spreads with impossible speed despite censorship. Pilgrims riot. Arbites enforce lockdowns. Ecclesiastical authorities proclaim judgment and holy trial. The Senatorum Imperialis fractures into emergency factions. Mars mobilizes. Luna fortifies. The Sol system becomes the center of a war, not only for survival, but for interpretation. Is this the death of the Emperor? His resurrection? The final battle? Every answer changes what people do next. Then the galaxy reacts. Traitor forces launch offensives. Xenos empires probe exposed sectors. Loyalist bastions fortify and claim continuity of imperial legitimacy. Peripheral regions become isolated statelets overnight. Some worlds never learn the truth and simply experience the slow death of interstellar contact. Others receive conflicting declarations from rival authorities, each claiming to act in the Emperor's true name. If Terra is consumed or rendered inaccessible, the symbolism alone may be enough to split the Imperium permanently. There could be successor Imperiums, Crusader kingdoms, Mechanicus protectorates, Shrine confederations, and martial dictatorships, all insisting they preserve true humanity. The High Lords, if any survive, might become refugees or figureheads. Guilliman, if active and reachable, would become perhaps the single most important stabilizing figure in existence. Yet even he could not hold together 1,000,000 worlds without navigable routes and a functioning center. And hovering over all of it is the question of the Emperor's fate. If he truly dies and nothing more happens, then humanity loses its greatest guardian at the exact moment it needs him most. That is the bleakest path. If he dies and is reborn in material form, then the galaxy enters an interregnum of horror while waiting for a savior who may emerge into ruins beyond repair. If he ascends as a warp god, then reality itself may convulse around the birth of that new power. Humanity might gain a divine patron of unprecedented strength, but the transition could kill untold trillions and alter the spiritual landscape forever. If some stranger outcome occurs, and in 40K, stranger outcomes are always possible, then all predictions fail. This uncertainty is why the Golden Throne is such a potent symbol. It is not just a machine keeping one man alive. It is the loaded hinge of the entire setting. Everything terrifying about the Imperium is contained in it. Ancient brilliance nobody can reproduce. Extreme dependence on sacrifice. Religious devotion wrapped around technical ignorance. centralization so severe that one failure could doom untold billions. Heroism and futility bound together. The hope that one more day of suffering might prevent the greater night. There is a grim irony, too. The Emperor once sought to free humanity from superstition, chaos, and dependence on dangerous psychic pathways. The Webway project was part of that dream. The Golden Throne, in a cruel inversion, became the mechanism by which humanity remains trapped instead. The dream of liberation collapsed into eternal maintenance. The machine intended to help build a rational future became the failing altar of a decaying theocracy. And yet, from another angle, the throne is also the reason humanity has not already gone extinct. For 10,000 years, despite every weakness, it has held. The beacon has burned, Terra has endured, the warp breach has been contained. Perhaps only barely, perhaps at unthinkable cost, but it has held. That may be the most unsettling answer of all. What happens if the Golden Throne fails is not only a hypothetical apocalypse, it is the revelation of how much apocalypse has already been postponed. The Imperium exists in the space between breakage and collapse. Every Hive-World sermon, every naval chart, every pilgrimage to Terra, every black ship carrying psychers to their doom, every custodian pacing the halls of the palace, every tech priest replacing one more sacred component, all of it serves the same unspoken admission. Humanity's empire is not standing on firm foundations. It is balanced on a malfunctioning miracle. And one day, the miracle may end. If it does, Terra may become a war zone, a tomb, or a portal to hell. The Astronomican may vanish, leaving the star pathless. Imperium may fracture into feuding remnants. Chaos may surge across the void. Mars may descend into desperation. Entire sectors may starve in darkness without ever knowing exactly why. And somewhere amid all of that ruin, the Emperor may finally die, or finally awaken, or become something no human being was ever meant to see. That is why the question matters so much. Because in Warhammer 40,000, the Golden Throne is not just a relic in the background. It is the last lock on the door, and nobody knows what is on the other side. If you enjoyed this deep dive, and you want more calm Warhammer lore to fall asleep to, make sure you subscribe, and let me know what impossible question we should explore next.